Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, it was 3:32 a.m. Daniel's room was dark. He had just opened his eyes behind a dream and was breathing quickly. His head was in the dark. In the space of his mind, there was only light from the small lamp in the corner of the room. Everything was normal until Daniel began to hear something. It was 3 knocks. Heck, heck, heck. The echoes of the room echoed in the quiet night. Listening more carefully, he confirmed that he was not imagining it. Daniel had lived here for more than a month and had never experienced anything unusual. Until now, he thought it was just the sound of the neighbors or the water lords who could still make noise. It was strange that he had just woken up recently at 3:33 a.m. He had dreamed of seeing a shadow standing in front of the door and knocking 3 times. The person did not speak, just knocked and then disappeared. Daniel felt uneasy but did not have enough faith to believe that this was true. That night he decided not to sleep anymore. He sat there, leaning against the wall and listening. In the quiet space, he was afraid that even the smallest sound would make his heart beat faster. Then, at 3:33 in the morning, just like in his dream, Daniel once again heard 3 knocks. Heck, 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 but this time the sound was clearer and much closer, as if someone was knocking right in front of the door. Daniel touched the door and it was still locked. He didn't dream, he just sat there, anxious. There was no voice, no footsteps, only the sound of knocking repeating in Daniel's mind. The more he thought, the more he felt the presence of something invisible in this room. The warnings of the landlord began to appear in his mind. When he entered the room, Daniel remembered that the landlord had said something like a lullaby. If he had heard the knock at 3:33 in the morning, he would have been in Daniel's dream when he was there, laughing and thinking that it was just a folk saying to scare people, but this time things were no longer simple after the knocking ended. Daniel felt an unusual amount of cold air in the room. The temperature dropped suddenly. He felt as if someone had just walked in. He turned around to look around the room, but nothing had changed. Everything was still the same. Daniel decided to check around. He took out his phone and turned on the flashlight to shine into every corner of the room. Using the light to shine into the mirror, he saw a figure standing behind him. The heat returned, but it was just a void. Daniel's heart was pounding. The panic had reached its peak. He ran to the bed and tried to convince himself that it was just an illusion, that it was just a cold. When he looked at the clock, it was already 3:45 and there was no more knocking. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Just lying there listening in his head, he repeated the question, what is happening out here, and why is it always 3:33 a.m.? The next morning, Daniel decided to ask the landlord about the people who had lived in this room before. The landlord hesitated for a moment and then spoke only one sentence, said very softly, hoping that the person did not hear it the second time. Daniel felt a chill down his spine, even though it was the first time. There was clearly a feeling that the truth he was facing was not normal. He returned to his room with a feeling of unease. At that time, he decided to leave his phone to record a video while he slept so that if anything happened, at least there would be evidence. Daniel placed the camera facing the door and climbed into bed. Then the feeling in the dark continued to cover the room. Everything was so strange that every detail on the power line became terrifying. Suddenly, the camera started to flicker and then the screen turned off. Daniel did not notice when the clock struck 3:33 a.m. 3 more beeps rang out. This time it's even stronger. Heck, heck, heck. Something is holding the door of the hospital's room. Daniel is sleeping soundly in a dream. Those who watch the video will see a fragile white shadow step into the room through the open door. The camera automatically freezes for 17 seconds and then turns off. After that, everything goes quiet. Daniel doesn't know that the room is open at night. Who is the knocker and what is waiting for Daniel at 3:33 a.m. the next morning? The next morning, Daniel couldn't hide the confusion in his heart. He opened the camera to watch the video that had been recorded. The first thing he saw made his heart stop. The camera screen clearly showed 3:33 a.m. The angle of the room's entrance was dark, with only the light coming from the hallway outside and then entering the door. When the clock's hands touched 3:33 a.m., something strange happened. The door suddenly opened, clearly visible before going to sleep. A white shadow slowly appeared and then walked into Daniel's room while he was sleeping soundly, completely unaware that another force was invading his living space. Daniel fell back onto the bed and closed his eyes when he saw the video. The white shadow stood in front of his bed, almost shining straight into the camera's eyes, and began to smile a cold smile. The door automatically turned on and the camera continued to roll in the dark until morning. He turned his back on the chair and sighed. He used to think that what he experienced was just a dream, but now it was clear. Daniel sent the video to a friend who was an engineer specializing in photography. His name was Thomas. After watching the video, he confirmed that there were no signs of editing. Everything was real. Daniel asked Thomas if he believed in spirituality. Thomas said that there were things that science could not explain and that this video could be proof of the existence of a parallel world next to us. At that time, Daniel decided to stay up until morning, put the camera at a higher angle and covered it with a curtain so that it would not be seen. For him, this was no longer a game. This was a battle between him and a world. Invisible moment, unknown purpose. He knew that if he wanted to escape it, he had to understand clearly where it came from, and what it wanted. Monday night came again. Daniel left the camera rolling while trying to sleep at 3:20 a.m. He sat there. In a daze, the air in the room began to change. The temperature dropped to freezing cold. Although it was the office door, but it seemed like someone was walking around outside. Something was soft, very fragile, but clear, like a whisper. The whisper seemed to be coming straight into Daniel's ear from behind the strong hand, holding the doorknob. Once more, the sound of a door being knocked, heck, 3 times like every night, but this time Daniel was ready. He repeated the next few times, then walked closer to the door and put his ear on the wooden bench, listening. The other side was strangely silent. Then the second knock appeared. Heck, it was clear it was coming from outside, but it was the same. Daniel's mind was in turmoil. This time, he decided to open his eyes. He turned the door and locked it quickly, but no one was there. The hallway in the house was quiet, and everything was unusually quiet. What scared Daniel was the sudden drop in temperature and the coldness he felt in the air, as if someone had just walked through. Daniel checked all the rooms. He felt like he was being followed. When he returned to his room, he saw that the camera cover had been taken off and placed on the floor. It was obvious that someone or something had touched it. When he checked the camera again, the entire video from 3:33 was completely white, then black, and the screen turned off. It was impossible to change anything new in that video. Daniel decided to write a diary, recording every night in detail to see if there were any rules. For him now, life was no longer peaceful days and nights. Is a terrifying cycle that begins at 3:33 every morning and ends with an increasingly terrifying truth. Awakening in the dark, Daniel knows he has entered a story that if he continues, there will be no turning back. The third night has come. Daniel is no longer himself. Tired of all the worries, the continuous confusion makes his eyes and mind spin. He has gotten used to the feeling of peace in the dark. All that remains is a high level of alertness and invisible fear. In the diary pages, Daniel begins to write down every smallest detail. Every time the shadow appears, it is at 3:33 in the morning. Each time there are the same signs. The temperature drops sharply. The sound of knocking 3 times and a clear presence next to the bed. He begins to think about the possibility that this is not just a shadow, but a ghost that has been stuck in pain and wants to send some kind of message to the outside world. At that time, Daniel decided not to sleep, but to sit and wait in the dark. He turned off all the lights in the room so that the space is exactly the same as the previous nights. The camera is ready. He placed an additional recorder near the door of the room, and the other thing near the bed. The young man sat on the bed, his eyes fixed on the door of the bedroom, his mind becoming hazy between reality and dream. He felt as if he was facing something that did not belong to this world. At 3:33 in the morning, the knocking sound appeared, but this time it was clearer and stronger than before. Heck, the knocking sound was strong and filled with joy, as if the person knocking had some unusual emotion. He was extremely panicked. Daniel ran back to the door and opened each door almost in despair. When the door opened, he saw only a wide hallway, but he felt something standing there, as if it were only a few centimeters away. Daniel ran back to the bed, but this time he did not blink. He waited and listened. When he turned to look in the mirror on the wall, he was terrified to see a white shadow standing behind him, its face dark and smiling. It was the face that Daniel had dreamed. In recent dreams, Daniel turned around, but there was no one in the room. He began to breathe without sweating, and from the beginning he fell to his knees. The sound of ghosts began to ring out, not from outside, but from within Daniel's head. No, a sound was mixed with the cries of a child and the laughter of an old woman. No, it made Daniel so tired that he was about to faint. He turned back to the camera and turned off the recorder, then sat down on the floor and closed his eyes. At that moment, Daniel knew he could not react in time. The truth was that he was being connected to a spirit, a force without his permission. Tonight, when he reviewed the camera, Daniel discovered something even more horrifying than before. In the video that the camera captured clearly at 3:33, the white shadow not only appeared, but it came to the bed. Daniel touched his head and began to whisper nonsense words and then laughed in the darkness. The recorder recorded Daniel's voice as if he were in a trance. This was no longer an accident, but a clear connection between Daniel and the spirit. The next day, Daniel brought everything he had recorded to Thomas. This time, he didn't laugh anymore. He was silent for a while and then told Daniel that he was being dragged into a story that was not just a haunted story, but a curse, and that if he didn't find its source, he would lose control and the spirit would take over his body. Thomas' words shocked Daniel, but also made him more alert. He returned to the room, locked all the equipment, and sat down in front of the mirror. He looked straight into his eyes and said, "I want to know who you are and why you chose me." The black shadow in the room flickered and stopped. He knew he had touched the sensitive point of the story. He was close to the truth, but also closer to the abyss. Daniel finally knows that the next night will be a turning point. Stay tuned for the next episode. Daniel returned after a night of terror with a new determination. He knew that if he did not find the source of this curse, every night would become hell on earth. The truth was that the white ball did not only appear to threaten, but it wanted to connect with him, wanted to say something, wanted to be heard. After a slow and sleepy sleep, Daniel began to learn about the area of the apartment he lived in. Apartment number 4 on the second floor of the building called Redstone, a building that had been there for nearly 100 years. The previous owner did not say much, only wanted to guarantee the contract and money. But now Daniel needed the truth. He returned to see Thomas, told him everything, and the two decided to investigate together. The beginning of the journey that led them to the court was the very place where the construction records and local history were stored. After an hour of searching through the old files, they discovered important information. In 1978, apartment number 4 was the scene of a murder case. The person living there was a woman named Clara Monroe. She lived alone and mysteriously disappeared at exactly 3:33 a.m., according to the news from the newspaper at that time. Clara was discovered missing after many neighbors heard the sound of a gunshot and a knock coming from the apartment. The door was locked from the inside. There were no signs of a break-in, but she had disappeared without a trace. From then until now, the apartment had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, until it was repaired and rented out. The weather was cold when Daniel realized that Clara had disappeared. The month he moved in was only 45 years apart. He returned to the room with his old magazine and Clara's brother, a middle-aged woman with a sad smile in her eyes. Daniel began to hear a soft knocking sound coming from inside the apartment. The clear sound of a woman's laugh was so long and hard he felt the cold milk from his back rise to his feet as he turned his face towards the mirror. Once more he saw Clara standing behind him, looking at him with a pair of deep eyes and aching legs. Daniel turned quickly, but the room in the dark shadow beat continuously and then stopped. He decided to do what he thought was obvious. He said to Clara, "If you need anything, let me know. I want to help. I don't want you to suffer anymore." He sat down on the floor, facing the door, and waited. Was it possible that a part of Daniel's personality had accepted Clara's presence as something that was close and needed to be released? He was no longer afraid, he just needed an answer at that moment. From under the bed, an old diary was pushed out. It was a diary with a pink page, printed with a white shadow of Clara Monroe. The book was all over the place, but still readable. Daniel opened the first page, trembling. Clara's words were about loneliness and sleepless nights and hearing knocks at 3:33 in the morning. A sentence just written here made Daniel jump. With fear, I heard knocks 3 times every night, and I knew someone was trying to talk to me, but it wasn't me. Daniel's back was cold. I knew it was me from the present trying to talk to me from the past. That sentence was like a prophecy, like a connection between 2 souls stuck on 2 sides of time. Daniel clasped his hands and held the diary in tears. "Clara, if you're really here and want to talk to me, please guide me." He put the diary on the nightstand and sat still. For me, today there is no presence of the white shadow, no knocks, no laughter, just silence. Daniel knows that the storm is just beginning, and what awaits him in Clara's presence will change everything. Daniel was determined to hold the diary in his hand, constantly tapping it. Clara Monroe's diary seemed to have been through a long time, full of dust and the musty smell of forgetfulness. The words written in blue ink had to be opened, but were still full of feelings of loneliness and pain. The first pages were the normal confidences of a woman living alone. But as the book progressed, Daniel could see the changes in Clara's spirit. She began to record phenomena such as the sound of knocking at night, the sound of whispering in the room, and the feeling that someone was watching at night. She wrote that she saw a shadow in the mirror, and that she had once lost consciousness and woke up in the morning with scars on her hands, that he didn't know where they came from. Daniel felt a chill down his spine. because each word he wrote seemed to reflect what he had experienced. The most terrifying things happened at the end of the diary when Clara began to talk about a spirit. More than 3 believe that living in the apartment, 3 believe that he is being controlled by a magical force she has had. Clara writes, I dreamt that I was standing in front of a young man. I don't know his name, I feel familiar with him, and every time I wake up, it's at 3:33 in the morning. Daniel is scared. He knows the person in the dream is him. He doesn't know how to explain it, but it's clear there is a connection between him and Clara, not only through space but also time. Daniel slowly rolls up the diary and puts it on the table, then puts his hands on the door, in his head full of questions. If Clara saw him in the dream, does it mean everything started a long time ago? Hasn't his presence awakened a long-lost cause? This connection is binding them both into a terrifying loop. In the dream, Daniel falls asleep and then wakes up in a dream standing in Clara's room, but it was different. Everything was blurred but very clear. Clara sat on the bed with her back to him. Her long hair was shaking. Daniel called her name, but she didn't turn around. She just tried to save me, and then everything disappeared. Daniel was sweating profusely, but his head was still pounding with that image. It was midnight. He tried to contact Thomas, telling him everything he had just experienced. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said Daniel might be in a state of spiritual connection, and if it was real, the only thing that could be done to end it was to take that soul to its final place, a place where everything had begun. Daniel went back to the diary, finding the last page where Clara wrote that there was a place in the house she had never dared to enter, a locked room on the 3rd floor, a place where she heard crying but no one could open. Daniel knew that if one to bring everything to the end, he had to find the room tonight. He started climbing to the 3rd floor of the building he had never set foot in. The creaking sound of the wooden stairs in the dark night led to that haunted place. When he reached the door of the room, Daniel felt a heavy pressure, as if something was warning him not to open the door, but he knew he couldn't back down anymore. When his hand touched the man's hand, Daniel suddenly felt cold, but when he turned around, he saw another word on the door, with Clara No's name, letting him know he had come to the right place. The night was dark and quiet, surrounding the Redstone building. Daniel held the flashlight in his hand and walked up the stairs to his grandmother's grave, the place Clara had mentioned in the last page of her diary. In Daniel's mind was a vast, free-flowing web of notes, the forgotten wooden voice, and Clara's silhouette. He had never been up there before, and no one in the building had ever wanted to mention his grandmother's grave so clearly. The room at the end of the hallway showed signs of being forgotten by time, covered with layers of dust and mold. Its male arm was rusty and looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. Daniel stood in front of this room, his chest pressed against the ceiling, but there was no way back. He reached out and touched his male arm. This time his face felt cold, not just from the metal, but from the invisible pressure that was pressing on his shoulder. When he turned his male arm, it opened unexpectedly, not as he had imagined. The door opened with a screeching sound and rang. Like a warning, Daniel walked into the room. It was a small room with no windows, only a bed with a broken wooden desk and an old suicide note. The room was covered with blurred pictures, as if drawn in a bloody book. He approached the suicide note, and inside was a small wooden box. Daniel took it out and found many old pieces of paper and a small book that looked like a diary, but it was someone else's. He opened it and couldn't believe his eyes. The first page was a very clear sentence: I was stuck somewhere. I had left. I didn't know who I was, but I remembered I was once a child. Daniel found many pages of notes in the dark that looked like someone had lost control. Some pages only said 3:33. over and over again until Daniel was stunned. These words were clearly from someone who was either mentally ill or insane in the case of the wood. There was a photo of a child crying in this very room. Daniel knew that whoever he was, the child inside him had been through a lot. In this room, when he turned around, Daniel saw on the wall a small letter written in something that looked natural but could still be read. If he could read this, it meant he was awake. Atmosphere in the room began to change abnormally. The light from the flashlight flickered on and then went out. In the darkness, Daniel felt as if someone had just walked in. He heard a sound, unclear where it came from, then the sound of knocking. 3 times, heck, 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 it rang out right behind him. Daniel turned around, but it was only darkness, but it was clear that something was watching him. The voice rang out clearer than the first time he heard it. The woman's hoarse laughter rang out. Daniel refused to speak. He ran out of the room, still holding the wooden box and the book. He ran down the stairs, but the footsteps behind him seemed to be following closely. When he got to his apartment, Daniel locked the door and gasped and fell down on the bed. His heart was filled with questions about the child in him, about the story of the long lines and the connection between Clara and the soul trapped in the old woman's room. Was the room the source of everything? Daniel knew that he had opened a room that could represent the thoughts of another world. A chosen vow that was fun for a while, but never forgotten. Stay tuned for the next episode. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his husband in the old wooden box and the number taken from the shelf. Everything that happened was like a horror movie outside. Every page was a piece of the puzzle that no one had solved yet. Daniel replayed the number again in his head. The image of the locked room and a letter Clara left on the door of the Lord slowly grew in his mind. Daniel began to reread each note of an anonymous person, but it was clear that he was caught in a spiritual loop. Suddenly, the voice of a ghost appeared for the first time in Daniel's room. The sound was so soft that it was hard to recognize, but it was clear that it was not someone else in the building. It was the voice of a child. It was the voice of a child. In another night, Daniel turned his eyes and looked around the room, but there was no one in that voice. Were meaningless words that were made up, repeating like a long and lingering lullaby. I'm here, I'm cold, I can't see. I'm here, I'm cold, I can't see. Daniel felt like his inner world was no longer contained in the sound of the wood, but now it had turned into a voice. In Daniel's head, he was spinning. He began to lose the distinction between reality and illusion. He ran out to the balcony facing the dark city, but the sound was so distant it didn't disappear. It followed outside, as if the whole building had been absorbed. In this sound, Daniel called Thomas, in a state of confusion. Thomas, from the moment he received the call, felt something strange in Daniel's spiritual world had expanded beyond his own limits. The voice was no longer limited to the space of the room. It had invaded his awareness. Every moment, Daniel began to record the times. The voice appeared and sent it to Thomas. The friend, the engineer, analyzed the sound and discovered something extremely strange. A real voice with a frequency that the normal human ear could not produce. It was between a child's voice and a simulated voice of another gender. Not only that, Thomas also heard an older woman's voice, speaking more clearly than in the recording. I told you to stop listening. That voice sounded exactly like what Daniel had heard in his dream about Clara. Reality was melting away. Daniel felt like he had lost control of his life. In his confusion, Daniel returned to the locked room on the 3rd floor. In his hand, he took the battery and the recorder. He placed the recorder on the table and said clearly, "If anyone really wants to talk, say it now." He turned it off and sat down in the corner of the room. After a few minutes of listening, Daniel suddenly heard the creaking sound of wood. as if someone was walking closer and then sitting down next to him, behind his back. Behind his back, the temperature suddenly dropped, the hot breath hit his ear coldly, and the voice was, "There, the place was on fire. I was dead there." Daniel turned around, but there was no one there, was only darkness, and the room was cold, as if there had never been life. He turned back to check the recorder and heard the voices clearly. On the table couldn't play anything. Daniel began to put the pieces together. It was becoming a horrifying picture of a forgotten scene in history. This building had a perfect fire. Hidden, it happened on the 3rd floor. Clara had predicted it and tried to warn, but no one believed. Now that curse was shining on everyone who touched it. Daniel had no choice. He knew he had to find out the truth about the perfect fire of the past. If not, he would be the next one, trapped in a vicious cycle with no way out. Spiritual Gate. Please follow the next episode. After the whispers and the touches on the border between reality and fantasy, Daniel understood that this origin originated from a real adventure that had been chosen for fun and had been neglected for many years. The Redstone building was not only an old building, but also a shrine to the souls that were stuck together. In the middle of the night, Daniel returned to the city library to search for old magazines. He first saw the name Redstone appear in a small news item in 1975. A headline humbly paid homage to a small fire at the old building on Allen Street with no casualties. Daniel felt cold. The wheel moved quickly to the museum. It was cut from the old magazine in the flash news section without anyone noticing. What shocked Daniel was that the address in the article was consistent with the building where he lived, and the details of the fire were not small. It happened at 3:33 a.m. Everyone was sleeping soundly and fell asleep on the 3rd floor after a series of knocks, and the fire was reported by the people around. The newspapers said that no one was injured and the incident was quickly put out. Daniel returned to the building with a copy of the newspaper in hand and found Thomas, and together they compared the time of the fire with the notes in Clara's diary. Daniel then returned to the room where the fire was being held. He opened the battery again and followed the black marks on the wall. Something began to appear in the light. Things gradually became more serious when Daniel discovered another piece of paper stuck in the wood under the old bed. The paper was from 1978, 3 years after the fire, and recorded the disappearance of a woman named Clara Monroe. It was discovered that she had filed a complaint with the police about someone being killed in the fire, and that she had Daniel wanted to investigate the truth and realized that Clara was the only one who knew the truth, and that was why she had been robbed of her freedom so cruelly. The words in Clara's diary began to shine through Daniel's mind. Clara knew something and was stunned by her sudden disappearance. The more he dug, the more Daniel saw this house as a plane that swept away everyone who touched the truth. Daniel's mind began to be confused. He had dreams about Clara, about a child, and about a man in the fire. His old bed collapsed with a small creak as Daniel pulled it out of the wall. Behind the old wooden table was a pot that had not been sealed. Daniel reached in and pulled out a small metal box containing many cursed objects. Inside were a burned-out tea tree and a thick wire. His heart was crushed, and he came to visit. Daniel felt a cold wind. Into the back, the voice rang out again. I ran, but couldn't escape. Daniel turned around, but only my shadow was left. I was shocked and fell from the power off. He was stunned and heard footsteps on the floor slowly leading to him. The sound of knocking 3 times appeared. Next to a voice, clearer than Clara. Clara was the name of the person who was murdered. Daniel turned back to the apartment with a new Fear in his heart, the truth was revealed. Clara was not only a victim, but also the one who tried to save the truth about a murder case. Covered up by fire, Ho-Ho was not just an accident, it was a crime. Daniel understood that to end this curse, he had to bring what he saw to light. He had to let the truth be heard, or follow the next episode. Daniel sat motionless on the floor, his eyes fixed on the burning tea tree and the endless train of events. He felt his heart pounding as the pieces of the puzzle were coming together to form a heartbreaking picture. Clara was not only the victim, but also a witness to a housebreaking murder, and the perpetrator was still alive, or rather still present here. Daniel returned to Thomas, bringing with him everything he had found in the locked room. The pieces of the lost suitcase and the metal alloy. Thomas was also not without his panic when he saw the new pieces. He decided to connect with an old friend who was an investigator, and after just one night, they found a name: George Kramer. A name that had been involved in many real estate scams in the 70s. George was the one who bought the Redstone building and let someone else use his name to register the ownership. The building was said to have been built without fire safety, and there were many warnings about the electrical system. Daniel was shocked when he read a report that clearly stated that George Kramer had been reported to the government by Clara Monroe for illegal construction and set on fire due to substandard electrical system. The fire broke out just a few months after Clara filed the complaint, and then she disappeared. Daniel knew it was no coincidence. Someone could have designed the entire house to be set on fire and keep Clara quiet forever. He returned to the fire prevention room with a new determination. Daniel placed new cameras in the corners of the room and placed the metal box on the table and sat down in front of the mirror, just like Clara had done in her diary. He closed his eyes and said to Clara, "If you're still here, if you have anything to say, I'm ready to listen. This time, I'm not just a witness. I am the one who will bring the truth to light." Suddenly, Daniel's face in the mirror disappeared, and then appeared clearly on Clara's face. She stopped crying, but just looked straight at Daniel, and then disappeared. The sound of knocking 3 times rang out from inside the wall. Daniel suddenly ran back to look into it and discovered a hole behind the wall. This was where the story and the tree were located. He placed the camera to record, then reached in and took out a small bag containing a torn paper bag. Inside was an official report of the story that happened. The original was lost in the city's files. Daniel suddenly realized that someone had covered it up and brought another one to replace it. Clara's voice rang out again in Daniel's head, "Or bring it all to light. When the truth is heard, I will be free." Daniel knew that the truth was the key to the 333 curse, and the one who caused it all was George Kramer, or his spirit if he is no longer alive. Daniel takes the camera and all the papers and contacts the reporter. They decide to bring this case to the public in the form of a documentary. The secret of the Redstone building is being revealed, and every step is closer to the conclusion, but also closer to the dangers that Daniel could not imagine or follow. The next episode. A week after the final evidence of the fire on the floor, Daniel, Thomas, and the reporter held a small press conference in court. They brought all the evidence and the film filmed at the scene. Clara Monroe was honored as the person who tried to bring the truth to light before her disappearance, and was the victim of being forgotten in the drama of being chosen for fun for more than 40 years. The atmosphere in the press conference room was so quiet that it was as if Clara's spirit was also present. While Daniel talked about the diary, about the 3 knocks at 3:33, and the white bubbles appeared, the screen behind switched to the camera footage recorded at night. There was clearly the shadow of a woman standing on the floor, facing Daniel and then disappearing before the judge. The sound of the explosion echoed clearly in the projection room through the microphone, causing the whole room to freeze for a second. Wandered down and everyone began to stir. Some left, but most stayed to listen. Daniel felt a dark energy in the air. He knew that he had opened a door that could not be closed. Reporters reported the news to all the websites and the documentary film project about the Redstone. Building was quickly restored and put into production within 3 days. News about Clara Monroe returning like a fox on spiritual forums and evil could not escape. Things started happening continuously. At the Redstone building, many people told of nights when they heard knocking sounds from the ceiling, heard people crying in rooms that had never been opened. The police had to get involved, but found nothing except a series of new bloodstains. This phenomenon seemed to have happened recently. Daniel received an anonymous email in which he wrote only an unfinished story. George Kramer is not dead. He just disappeared and his body has never been found. Daniel asks Thomas and they start following the new traces from his file. Daniel discovers that George Kramer appeared at a mental hospital in the suburbs after the fire, but then disappeared there. No one recognized him, and the name registered was Gia. The images from the security camera matched George's picture in his old file. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. A certain amount of air entered his apartment late at night. The knocking sound reappeared 3 times, then 3 more times, then 3 more times. A total of 9 times in a row, each time a little stronger. Daniel knew that at some point, the evil spirits no longer wanted to be brought to light. Clara wanted the truth to be heard, but the perpetrators wanted to be kept in the dark. The flashlight in the room turned off the camera and recorded the image alone. Appeared sitting on the chair Daniel usually sat on, then turned to the mirror. From the mirror was the face of a man shimmering like flowers into the darkness. Daniel suddenly turned the room's mobile phone, which was closed, then locked with a long click. He knew that tonight might not be like any other night. Stay tuned for the next episode. The Redstone building was dark tonight. Not a sound, not a ray of light. Daniel felt as if his room had a life of its own. He felt as if all the escape routes had been cut off. Daniel reached for the battery on the table, but it wouldn't light up. All the electricity in the room was off, as if it were being controlled remotely. The door to the multidisciplinary department was frozen. When he turned around, Daniel saw the mirror start to freeze. The mirror froze like the sky, and in the middle of the mirror was a moving sign that said "Welcome back." Daniel stood there, unable to believe his eyes. Someone was controlling everything that was happening. Suddenly, a strong wind blew into the room and everything fell down. Daniel was thrown into a space so quiet that he couldn't hear anything but the continuous beating of his heart. 3 knocks rang out, then 3 more, half a second, and 9 more in a row. But this time, it didn't come from the door, but from the mind. Daniel ran to take the old lipstick and saw a handprint inside, as if someone had thrown it on the wall. The laughter behind him was clearly that of a cold and gloomy man. I said no. Daniel turned back, but saw only the shadow of the person in the mirror. Again, this time, it wasn't Clara, but a man with half a face, and the rest was a patch of black shadow. He was George Kramer, the one who caused all the drama. George appeared like a shapeless shadow, clearly just a force from my shadow. You shouldn't reveal what's forgotten. It's not for you. George's voice, like high metal glue, slipped into Daniel's eyes, and all the shadows turned back to the room started to freeze. Daniel couldn't move. Something was holding him back now. Clara's voice was starting to make him run. Daniel, then every now and then, one by one, it became a scream. Daniel started to get up and back out of the door, but the doors were still locked. George's laughter finally died away, but was followed by the cry of a child. Echoing in the distance, Daniel fell to his knees. His heart was beating so fast it felt like it was about to burst. He didn't know what to believe anymore. His biggest fear wasn't that he was scared, but that he was trapped by the truth. Daniel started to talk to himself like a man with no mind. If I was next, then at least I had to let the world know that Clara was right. Clara had told the truth, and George was back. He took out his phone and recorded a video in the dark, then read every move in the old room, holding it up to the light to charge. The gong appeared again, but this time it was from the other side in the mirror. When Daniel put his ear to the mirror, he heard a whisper, then a voice, then the second person. Daniel jumped back. Swallowing his tears, he looked into the mirror. The mirror had a corner exposed inside the mirror frame. A piece of something was twitching, like a living thing was Clara's soul, trapped in the mirror. Daniel put his hand to the mirror, then said, "I will take her out. When the truth is known, she will be free." The knocking stopped all, and then fell into silence. Daniel lay motionless in the room. His eyes fell on the ceiling. Then he begged, "Please stop knocking. I understand now." Daniel pressed his face against the mirror. The circular button in the lower left corner began to glow strangely. He put his hand on it and felt the coldness like ice. But it was not a normal feeling, but the coldness of something not of this world. The ghost's voice appeared again, this time clearer on the mirror itself. Clara's silhouette appeared. Her white face covered her eyes behind the mirror, and she smiled sadly. Daniel stood still. He said, in a breath of light, "If she heard me, tell me how to get her out." Clara didn't say anything, just put her hand up and pressed it to the same spot as Daniel's. Perfectly at that moment, the mirror began to change color from white to gray, then to black, but Clara's eyes were still clearer cold. Wind past Daniel, then the whole room. I hugged and looked at the mirror no more. Not his room, but another space, a place like a long hallway with no end but open doors, looking into only darkness. Daniel began to feel his mind being sucked into the mirror, as if from the other side there was an invisible suction force that wanted to devour his consciousness. He looked down at his feet that were no longer touching the ground. The sound of knocking 3 times appeared once more from inside the mirror. Then another voice clearly said, "I am Clara. I was connected to this mirror after I cursed George Kramer and was trapped here at exactly 3:33. I can't get out because of the curse of the building created by hatred and greed." Daniel felt his head spinning, but still kept his composure. He said, "I will get her out. I will break this curse. I will not ignore the mirror." There was a loud click, and a tear appeared, running across Clara's face. She turned away, and all the shadows returned. The mirror was crushed in one corner, and slowly, I thought nothing had happened. Daniel fell to the floor, breathing nothing behind him was the harsh voice of another person, a man's voice. "I told you not to touch." George Kramer appeared in the room, like a shadow, indistinctly again. No need for a clear form, just a silent presence. George approached Daniel slowly, step by step, as if glued by force from the other side. Daniel couldn't move. Every movement was passive, and the sound in the room seemed to stop. Only the sound of knocking and breathing. Daniel tried to reach out to grab the tape recorder that was recording, and said in a panic, "I will bring everything to justice. I will not let 3 must conclude. Clara has protected the truth, and I will continue." George wondered. The spirit of the repair, it was going back, and then disappeared into the darkness. Daniel fell back down again. When the mirror lit up again, Clara appeared one last time and said thank you, then disappeared. Then Daniel opened his eyes, and everything returned to normal. The light returned, the mirror returned to normal, but the knot was more obvious. Daniel knew he had just stepped out of another space between life and death, as fragile as the line between reality and dream. He knew the curse was not over, but Clara had been spoken and the truth had been revealed. As soon as Daniel woke up, after the night of facing the mirror and Clara's spirit, he felt his room become lighter, the temperature returned to normal, and the hot air of many nights disappeared. They started to light up and slowly walked out of the window, looking down at the Redstone building, still swaying but no longer feeling like being trapped in the dark. Daniel believed that Clara had been released. Her spirit had escaped the mirror, and because everything she had endured, the truth had finally been heard. But in Daniel's heart, he could not rest easy, because in the dark corner of his mind, there was still the sound of George Kramer's final voice, a cold laugh, a reminder that things were not over. The next day, Daniel met Thomas again and told him everything. He dreamed that he showed Thomas the notes in it, and Daniel said that if Clara was the first soul to be released, he would be the first to be released. Escape George is definitely not a trapped soul, but something else, that the soul has a purpose and does not want to be eliminated. Daniel puts forth a theory that George may have manifested into this building as a sign, and whenever someone touches the truth, it will awaken. The principle 333 is just the clock indicating the time when it becomes the strongest. Thomas agrees and suggests checking the building's electrical system, because after many events, it is possible that it has been trapped by a strange energy wave that is capable of maintaining a spiritual connection. Daniel and Thomas climb up to the 3rd floor, carrying a magnetic field meter and an infrared camera. When they arrive in front of the room where the explosion occurred, the device begins to emit strange metallic sounds, and then all the lights go out and it is dark. The presence of a huge force. Daniel stepped into the room again. The mirror was completely destroyed, leaving only the mirror frame and a bright spot in the middle of the floor, a spot like melting, but no smell. Daniel reached out to touch it and suddenly felt a sudden feeling of humiliation. The temperature suddenly dropped to the level of ice. In that moment, he clearly heard George's laughter from the bottom of the floor circling up, and then the word appeared on the wall. Vaguely thinking it was over, Daniel felt like he was being held back. Again, he turned back to go outside, but the door had closed automatically. The lock was like someone was holding him. Daniel ran back to the wooden door, but it was useless. Thomas stood outside listening to the sound, trying to open the door, but couldn't, then knocked on the door continuously. Daniel from inside, "Clearly, I'm still in here. Open the door, quickly." Thomas took the spring. Daniel was freed for the 2nd time. But this time, it was clear that someone was testing him to see how far George Kramer's warnings and forgiveness would go. Daniel turned back to his room, turned off the lights, thanked Thomas, and lay down on the floor, wondering if George was not only the one who had caused the chaos, but was hiding something far greater than Daniel and Clara had ever known. He turned his eyes to the ceiling. There was nothing but darkness, and then a loud bang rang out. It wasn't over yet. Daniel began to hear clearly in his head, the voices repeating over and over again, like unfinished recordings, the sentences that didn't end. The words lingered in his consciousness and then disappeared like a cold wind that passed through and hit him at full speed. Daniel's heart beat fast. He looked around the room. There was no more darkness, but no more light. Everything was in a kind of grey state that made everything seem vague. Daniel felt like someone was watching him from the ceiling. Coldly, it wasn't George, and it wasn't Clara. It was something else, colder, more emotional and emotionless. Daniel approached the mirror again, but this time, nothing appeared, except for a tear that had frozen on his face, as if someone had touched the mirror from the inside. He ran back to his desk and searched the old diagrams. Reopening the old pages now, it seems like there are new characters appearing, but the characters are not Clara's nor Daniel's no is something that is written in tears. The character that was written here before George. Daniel was shocked and felt shocked, because if this character is real, then the spirit in this building did not start from the end, but was another force that existed long ago. George was just the one who touched the curse and became a part of it. Daniel ran to see Thomas, to see the scale again, but when Thomas touched his hand, the paper was hot and cold. For a few seconds the character disappeared before them. Daniel realized that someone or something was controlling the information, wanting to keep everything in the dark so that no one could find the true source. Daniel returned to the building. But this time he did not go to the 3rd floor, but went down to the old basement, always abandoned and haunted by the structure of love. Daniel went down the stairs with a flashlight and a tape recorder, but when he reached the end of the hallway, he saw a door nailed with a series of nails. Daniel took a step from the light to the clear. 3 knocks, then silence. He put his ear to the door and heard people whispering and a laugh that did not belong to any soul before. The laugh had something inhuman-like to many people talking at the same time. Daniel identified the details of each and everything. Then, when the door opened, inside was a small space but full of black marks and erased characters. On the wall, Daniel turned the camera and shined the light everywhere, then suddenly saw a sign with the letter B on the wall, and below it was the owner Redstone. Daniel turned back. His heart pounded, then turned off all the cameras and the light from the battery turned on to bright and then turned off. Daniel felt as if someone had just stepped over his shoulder. He turned around and suddenly ran out of the cave. He climbed up the stairs and fell right in front of his apartment door. When he opened his eyes, Daniel saw in his hand a symbol that was the same as the symbol on the wall of the medical room. Daniel had a feeling that George was just being used and that there was a more sinister force waiting for him. Daniel woke up in a state of exhaustion and pain and felt like all his strength was being sucked out. When he opened his eyes, everything became dark. His body was cold, despite the bright room outside was shining with golden light, but inside Daniel felt like he was still stuck in some dark space in his head, still humming laughter and meaningless sentences. Daniel sat up and looked around. He turned back to his desk and found that the symbol on his hand had disappeared, but in its place was a small footprint that looked like a child's handprint, printed on an A4 paper, placed on the table. His hands were shaking as he picked up the paper to see and found the words written in red were still there. Daniel felt the blood all over him, running out to the wooden corridor of Thomas's room, but saw no one opening the door to the golden building. Daniel knocked on the surrounding rooms all the way to the door, as if the building was in a state of being locked from the inside. He returned to the apartment and found that all the clocks were on at 3:33 a.m. He took out the camera to review the footage from yesterday, but everything was broken and then turned off as if someone had erased it. While Daniel was checking the room, he found a cave behind the library was a small tunnel that was not on the map of the building. The tunnel was covered in dark wood and was about to open. Daniel decided to step in with a flashlight. He walked through a narrow, dark hallway. The walls were covered in time stains, as if they had been burned. The light of the flashlight flickered and he walked down the hallway, ending in a door that was made of iron. Daniel knocked 3 times and then fell silent. And suddenly the door opened slowly for a moment. The wind was cold into his face and a pungent smell hit Daniel's nose in the evening, and he saw a large room with no windows. In the middle was a circle, drawn with a liquid substance that looked like blood. The stone was dry, but still kept its shape clearly. Inside the circle was a tall wall covered by old pieces of wood. Daniel scratched each piece of wood and discovered a painting of a strange creature that had a humanoid shape but no face. Just a dark shadow with unusually long arms. This was not George and not Clara. This was something that did not belong to this world. This was the true source of all curses. Daniel turned around and ran out, but the sound of the ghost appeared again, this time clearer. He felt like he had seen me before, so he stopped hoping. Daniel was pushed into the wall, his face hit the wood and he fell to the floor. Another room when the man opened. His eyes all around was absolute darkness. On the wall were other words that Daniel could not understand. In the corner of the room, a small shadow appeared, then grew into the shape of a child with wide eyes. Looking at Daniel without blinking, then slowly opened his mouth saying it was not George who started, but him. Daniel suddenly ran away, but every door was closed. The sound of knocking from everywhere then silenced. Daniel turned towards the child, then it disappeared, leaving only the word on the wall turned into blood. The original bridge should not have gone behind. Daniel knew that he had just touched a sight more terrifying than any soul had encountered. A force sitting behind every curse, a force to the extreme that had ruled this building since before George appeared. After seeing the change in the writing on the wall, Daniel was stunned and his mind was completely stuck out of reality. When he stepped out of the room, under his jaw, he imagined that he was in the basement of the Redstone building, but everything had changed. The hallway was blocked and stretched out as if there was no end. Darkness engulfed everything. The battery had no light. The camera was dead. Daniel called Thomas's name many times, but there was no chance to respond. Every sound was sucked into space as if being swallowed. Daniel ran randomly in the darkness, and then for a moment he had no sense of time. He didn't know how long he had been walking. His footsteps seemed to be held back by imaginary energy. Suddenly, in front of him was a rotating wheel that turned slowly and then accelerated. Daniel was sucked into that rotating wheel and then into a new space where no form was real. Everything was like a blurred picture. Faceless people appeared and disappeared. Some laughed, some cried, some spoke in hushed voices, languages Daniel didn't understand. Daniel tried to tell me who he was, but no one answered. He was just a single point of light in a sea of darkness. He felt himself being stuck to a floor as black as water, on which were ancient symbols like the symbols he saw in the sealed room. Under his jaw, he reached out and touched a symbol, and suddenly all the light and darkness disappeared. Daniel was sucked into the inner layer of a world beyond human shadow. There were wandering souls with no faces and no names, only circles surrounding them. Daniel felt like all the energy he had absorbed had been drained, so his memories were shattered and scattered. Daniel saw Clara looking from afar. I turned away. He saw George turn his back and melt into a wall and then dissolve into the darkness, forming a large, primitive figure with a face that was a vast mass with arms spinning. Daniel then said, many voices put together, he was in and couldn't get out again. This is our home. Daniel tried to run, but he just spun in that space, then fell down. He started to cry, but there were no tears. Feelings were drained. Then, in the middle of the darkest moment at that time, a small light appeared in the distance. Daniel left everything behind, continued walking there. Each step was like walking on fire. There were shadows climbing on his feet. Each step closer, a white shadow appeared right in the middle of that light, and when Daniel got closer, he realized it was himself looking at him, the Daniel of the present opposite the Daniel of the mirror. Daniel of the words, the last thing he said was that there was no way to escape. The only choice was to close his eyes or be swallowed by them. Daniel closed his eyes and slowly said, "I won't run anymore, and I won't let it continue to swallow the others. Everything will end here." As the words left his mouth, his hair started to turn black like a mirror and all the light in his eyes. Daniel felt like he was being pulled out of another room and back in a very strong wind, and he suddenly woke up. When he opened his eyes, Daniel was lying on the floor of the Redstone building, but there was no one around. All the doors were open. The morning sun shone into the room carefully. But in his heart, Daniel knew he had just stepped out of a place where no human should ever set foot. Daniel opened his eyes and saw that he was lying on the cold floor of the house. The air around him was dead silent. He sat with his hands on his hips, his heart still pounding like a king who had gone through a great struggle between life and death. He looked out the window and saw that everything was familiar, but there was something very different. The Redstone building had no sound from the apartments. It was as cold as a dream. Daniel touched the wall and felt cold and gloomy, as if the air from another world still lingered on the surface of matter. He walked out into the hallway, but all the rooms were locked. Not a sound, not a man or woman appeared. He knocked on Thomas's door many times, but there was no sound. Daniel ran down to the bathroom and saw that the bathroom was suddenly turned off. Everything was left behind, as if everyone had left suddenly. He went back to his apartment and opened the mirror on the wall. The mirror was changed, but what made Daniel scared was that the person in the mirror was not him. That person smiled and then turned away and disappeared. Daniel ran to the mirror, put his hand on it, and took out a flashlight to examine every line on the mirror's surface. There was no trace of repair, but it was clear that the mirror had been changed. Daniel began to feel that the world around him was changing, or that he himself was no longer a part of the old world. He turned on the computer, but all the video files that had been recorded before had disappeared. The camera was also not working, but the battery was still there. He turned out to the balcony and looked down at the street to see people walking around, but everyone was wearing masks. Their eyes were not clear. The sun was shining, but there was no heat, as if the whole city was covered by an invisible curtain. Daniel began to meditate alone. "I'm back, but is this the place where I used to live?" He turned back to read his diary, but the new handwritten notes were written in his own handwriting, clearly showing that I had seen something I shouldn't have seen. I had entered a place no one should enter, and I didn't know if I was still me. Daniel saw the last word on the diary page and then disappeared. "I never returned." He was so confused that he turned and ran out of the room. Instinctively, when he reached the hallway, he saw symbols similar to those he had seen in the back of the building, but this time they flickered clearly on the surface of the wall. It felt like he was meditating. When the light came on, he saw a shadow running past very quickly. Daniel ran down to the first floor and saw the main door of the building collapsed, but outside was absolute darkness. No city, no sky, no sound, just a shapeless void. Daniel turned around back, and now on the wall there is a welcome message. The world out there is only memories. Daniel knows that he has been stuck in a new reality where time no longer runs, and truth is created by a force that informs everything. Stay tuned for the next episode. Daniel returned to his apartment in a state of uncertainty. Everything around him was familiar but different, like a distorted copy of reality. He decided not to run anymore, but to find the source of everything. Daniel opened the old notebook again but saw something new on the last page. A word was written more clearly than I had seen its name. He knew that if he wanted to end everything, he needed to know who was in charge of the building. Daniel decided to return to the place he had been feeling before. When he got there, he turned on the battery and the camera turned back on the wall. But the symbol was now flickering stronger, as if reacting to his presence. Daniel entered the old space and returned to the sealed room where the ghost statue appeared. When the light was shined on the statue, he saw a small metal plate cut into the floor at the foot of the statue. Daniel picked it up, and when he turned it back, then saw another word spoken without sound and without end. Daniel felt his heart beat fast. When he took out the metal plate, he saw it was a symbolic plate with a circle inside were ancient characters that Daniel took a picture of and brought it back to the room. He turned on the light and edited the word, then discovered it was an old name of a legendary entity with this name that was never spoken out loud because saying it would awaken it. Daniel wrote the name slowly on the paper but did not pronounce it, only read it with his eyes. Then the atmosphere in the room changed suddenly. Darkness fell into the center. The mirror turned dark, then slowly transformed into the face of a scared person. Daniel saw a face without skin, no face, just a moving black mass. Then the sound of the voice appeared. Then you know why you called my name. Daniel was sucked into the mirror once more, and then down into a place like a dark valley where there was no sky, only trees and wind. Daniel met the shadows he had seen before, but this time they turned their backs and searched for that name repeatedly. Daniel realized that it was not just a force, but a collective intelligence created from every word, from every unjust death, from the pain of humanity, and was brought to this building by a dark ritual. Daniel realized the reason why no one could escape this building was because everyone carried within them a pain, and it was the material to nourish that body. While Daniel was listening to the words, suddenly he heard a voice, and a hand from the darkness reached out and pulled him back. Daniel tried his best to resist, and in the end he just said, "I will not be a part of it all." When Daniel opened his eyes, he found himself in the middle of his room, but all the mirrors in the house were gone. That name was written on the mirror. Daniel knew that name was the key to all of it. Daniel sat in the middle of a broken mirror in his room. The mirror fragments reflected many different faces of himself. A feeling, a moment in his life, as if all his memories were being invaded by an invisible force from within. Daniel clearly remembered the name, but did not dare to say it again because he felt like if he just read it, everything would disappear. The name was like a tomb in Daniel's head. Every moment he realized that his every thought was being watched. Daniel felt like someone was moving around in the space around him, on the ceiling, in the wall, in the dark. He turned the camera back to the corner of the room and saw a big shadow falling from the ceiling and moving across the room. When Daniel stood up, the shadow disappeared, but everything did not return as before. On the wall appeared a new movement, written in a language like blood. Did our people not have it? Forgiving, and now you will be the last person. Daniel knew he had touched the embrace of an entire generation that had been pushed into death and raised to live for the world. At that moment, Daniel left the room and climbed up to the platform. He wanted to find the highest position to end everything when the door of the platform suddenly opened, but it was not normal. It was like a force from another world he looked up to see. The characters that had been brought here, since when did Daniel not know? Daniel brought the metal symbol he found to the edge of the circle in the platform. Unexpectedly, the force moved strongly. All the darkness around was sucked to a point, then a sound like it had been in his consciousness. Daniel felt like he was falling into the space again, this time not falling into another world, but Falling into it was the place. After all, Daniel met all the grievances again before, but this time not. Afraid but hear the pain, they led Daniel to a corner of a large room in which there was another mirror. This mirror had no image, just a black frame, but when Daniel got close, it showed the image of the body standing in the middle of the room. Eyes with swirling flames on the body were the memories of being killed. It turned to look at Daniel and clearly said its name, then started walking closer to Daniel. Every step caused dark areas. Daniel had no choice but to close his eyes when that person reached out to touch Daniel. The whole space was bright then. All the enemies appeared around and simultaneously said a word of thanks, then disappeared. Daniel was pushed back to the stage, this time bright as day. Now it stopped. Daniel looked around, then focused on the metal symbol, now turned white. Daniel knew that forgiveness was complete. But that did not mean that his sins were forgiven. When Daniel opened his eyes again, he was still standing on the terrace of the Redstone building, but it was not like before. The sky was bright with no signs of wind and no shadows. Daniel looked around. The mirrors were all turned into tiny fragments, reflecting the golden light from the rising sun. Daniel felt a sense of peace in his heart that he had not felt for a long time. Since the day he entered this building, everything seemed to have ended, but he knew it was just a facade in his heart. Daniel still knew he no longer belonged to this world. When he returned to his apartment, he saw that the objects were covered in dust, as if he had disappeared for years, and the dials and cameras were dead and could not record anything. He walked step by step on the golden hallway, and then to Clara's room. He opened the door and saw that it had turned into a blank space without anything, nothing but a small piece of paper in the middle of the room. Daniel picked it up and read the words, "I'm freed, thank you." Daniel smiled and picked up the piece of paper and put it in his pocket. He turned back to the sky. At this time, it was starting to get dark. He walked step by step, down one step, then another half step, each step like the morning sun. Daniel saw familiar faces on the wall, as if the building was silently greeting him. When he reached the door, he opened it. He walked out into the late afternoon light. There was no one around. The street was golden, as if the whole city was sleeping. Daniel walked back towards his mother's old house. He returned to the place where everything had just begun. But when he reached the door, Daniel saw it was just a piece of wasteland. He turned back and went back to the Redstone building and walked straight inside. He knew there was nowhere else to go. He belonged to this place. When night down, Daniel walked alone to the old altar, placed the metal symbol on the old position, and sat down in the middle of the circle. His hands touched the ground again, and then his eyes closed. The clock rang in his head, 3:33, and then all the light came on. In the last moment, Daniel saw all the souls that had been bound appear around him. Clara stood closest to him, smiled and cried. Everyone said thank you. Together, a big light covered the room. When the light came on, Daniel was no longer there, but the building was still intact, and for the first time in dozens of years, there was no sound of wood. In the night, the police came to check the building, because the surrounding residents reported seeing strange lights and sounds, but when entering, all they saw was a large, empty space. The Redstone building was locked and declared unsafe once again, and all the birds went back to their old ways. But for a second, on the night shift, a security guard heard 3 knocks at 3:33, and then a voice saying the name of a person, Daniel.